Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to see such a full room for a topic that would have seemed rather obscure a year ago. As you all know, the point of this evening is to bring out the main points and have a discussion of this rather brilliant paper by Anton Chekovsov, Is Transition Reversible? The Case of Central Europe. Although there's a Polish flag on the cover, the paper was actually commissioned 9 months ago, and originally Poland was not part of the paper. And we added a short section at the end of the discussion of 4 other countries, Romania, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, just to take in some of the recent developments. Before asking Anton to talk a little bit more in depth about what's in the paper, I wanted to explain a little bit about my thinking, why we here thought it was such an important paper to commission even last year. And the answer is that the mythology, or the mythology makes it sound like it's not true, but the story of how democracy developed in Central Europe, how communism fell, how the EU and NATO enlarged to include a new group of states, how democracy built itself up in Eastern Europe, in a region that had been extremely unstable and very undemocratic for most of the previous century, in fact, is a really important story, not only in Europe, but all over the world. And there are, when you go to Ukraine, you hear Ukrainians say, when you ask them what they want, they say, we want to be like Poland. We want to follow that same path. When you go to Tunisia, as I did several times after 2011, and you ask them what they want to be, they also cite the story of democratization and the liberalization of Eastern Europe. So it's this question of what happens in the region, of course, has implications for the people who live there, and of course it has implications for Europe, but it also has an international implication of a kind that, I don't know if all of us always acknowledge. And the purpose of trying to look at the region as a whole and trying to look at the state of democracy in the region was partly to understand, what's the real state of that story? Is the myth true? Is democracy failing? Can it see? And also whether it's possible, even if we agree that many things had been achieved, is it possible to roll it back? And if so, what would that mean and how can it be stopped? Anyway, our author is Anton Chekovsov, who is a star on many levels. He is the author of several books, mostly about the far right and the growth of not just illiberalism in Central and Eastern Europe, but rather nastier things, the far right and fascism. And we're really, really lucky to have here tonight Sławomir Sierakowski, who's a quite famous Polish journalist, founder of a kind of group of magazines, called Krytyka Polityczna, which are he'll maybe explain for himself, which are kind of his answer to what he saw as the deficit of democratic debate, not only in Poland, which is where he's from, but in the whole region. But I thought we would start by, since I assume not all of you have read the paper, I thought I'm going to start by getting Anton to draw out some of the main points and some of the patterns that he found when looking at the region. As I said, the paper talks about Hungary, Romania, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, looking mostly at the media and also the state of debate about democracy in those 4 countries. And then there's a brief look at Poland, very brief, at the end. Anton, at the end of the paper, you have a list of patterns or things that causes of illiberalism or the sources of illiberalism in the region. Do you want to talk a little bit about that first?
Yes, and but before I start, I would like to say 2 things. First, that I'm immensely grateful to the Legatum Institute and Legatum Institute Foundation for supporting this research, because I think it was very, very important to put up a paper like this, looking at particular countries and the region as a whole. And second, very important point is that this paper is not anti-Central Europe. The drive behind this paper is actually admiration for Central Europe, but at the same time, some kind of concern about what is happening in the region. But again, it's not anti-Central Europe, it's not cultural colonization, or it's not a Orientalist paper. It is driven by admiration for the region. And when I started to write this paper, I looked at individual countries. When I looked at them, I didn't see any patterns on the individual level countries. But then applying very briefly methods from comparative politics, I saw that patterns do exist, and how illiberalism starts to spread in those countries on the individual level. We see similar things going on in other countries. For example, very often I notice that the illiberal turn starts with such thing as wiretapping. When pro-EU politicians, liberal democratic politicians, secret services or military intelligence or some external forces maybe as well, they wiretap those politicians, they leak those conversations or internal political debate on the party level, for example. And those leaks, they are not necessarily connected to corruption. They don't reveal any corruption, but they reveal some internal debates or chats, friendly chats, etc., and then those who leak them, they sometimes manipulate them in order to show those politicians in the bad light. This happened in Hungary, this happened in Slovakia, this happened in Poland. So this is the first pattern, how it starts. It starts with almost a security service operation to discredit pro-EU liberal democratic politicians. The second pattern is that usually the path to illiberalization opens up when a party acquires a parliamentary majority or, in some cases, constitutional majority. So this political party starts modifying the constitution in order to secure its political power for the years ahead, not only for their own term, but for the years ahead, for the future. Sometimes the EU tries to block some of the more dangerous or some of the more illiberal changes, but sometimes political parties find a way to outmaneuver the EU and still change the constitution in the way they want to. The third pattern is that this is what's happening with the state media and public media. A political party that wants to illiberalize the country, it usually uses its resources in order to appoint, first, of course, change the media law in order to institutionally undermine the free media environment, and then also appoint figures loyal to this political force or even members of that party to the crucial positions, the key positions in the media, heads of the institutions or editors of those media, etc. This is what happened. The fourth pattern...
Although, can I interrupt you? Because in your paper you speak about the state media, but you also talk about what you call the Berlusconiization of media, so that we see in this region, which is actually not at all unique to the east of Europe, but actually has echoes in much else, a problem of not just government trying to control the state media, which is sort of, we've seen that before in many places, but a more unusual new pattern of political officials trying to control all media, including private media, through various different forms.
Yeah, so this is a specific case of the Czech Republic, where Finance Minister Andrej Babiš, who has political power in a way, but also he bought up quite a significant share of the media in the country, and not only in the Czech Republic, but also in Slovakia. So he turned himself into sort of the Czech Berlusconi, Czech Silvio Berlusconi. But that is not the government as such. This is not a political force that changes this institutional environment, but these are individual politicians close to power. And this is why I call this process Berlusconization. And the fourth pattern, which I consider very, very important, is the rise of uncivil society. And what I mean by this, it is kind of a liberal civil society. And this is dangerous because politicians, even illiberal politicians, they come and go. Presidents come and go, prime ministers as well. But culture stays on. And for the illiberal politicians, it is very important to contribute to the proliferation of various conspiracy theories, of anti-EU, anti-NATO ideas. And the culture, this uncivil society, this illiberal
which is
culture,
another thing that happens all over the world now.
yes,
actually.
this is not
only
Central Europe. That in the 90s and in the beginning, even in the beginning of the noughties, that was a subculture, very marginal one. You know, with
you mean the subculture of sort of websites that promote conspiracy theories and say, you know, the United States wants to colonize the world.
Yes,
this kind of thing.
In the 90s, it was, you know, in the very strange sectors of the internet with, you know, very bad design of those websites. You know, it was a very fascinating, actually, topic of research, to do research on those websites. But now we see that these ideas, they appear in the glossy magazines, where you would have on the covers, there are some covers in the paper, you will see that EU is a Nazi project, that NATO is ruling the world. And then you also have how vaccination is bad, or something about the chemtrails. Chemtrails is this thing that the government allegedly sprays those liquids from the airplanes above the governmental buildings in order to control the government. You know, the very, very, very weird ideas. And this is now in glossy magazines. This has become a part of the mainstream culture, which is very, very dangerous because this creates an environment where illiberalism becomes acceptable. This becomes normal. It's quite okay. You know, sometimes you have in some countries in the region where illiberal politicians may be replaced by liberal politicians, but the uncivil society stays on. Illiberal culture stays on. And it makes it very difficult for the civil society to consolidate itself again after that period.
So you talk very specifically about all, those, in particular those four countries. And one of the things you note is that these things have risen and fallen in different ways in each of the countries over the last 25 years. You can look at Romania having had scarcely a democratic system in the beginning and becoming more like a liberal democracy with time. You see the opposite pattern in Hungary. Can you talk a little bit about, you've talked a little bit about why those things happen. Can you give an example of, how it is that countries, how this ebbs and flows? How does liberal democracy rise and fall?
Romania is a very good example in this case. In the 90s, during most of the 90s, Romania was not a liberal democratic country. It was a result of the process in the 1989. Romania did not have a proper revolution in the sense of the Central European sense. The first echelon of the Communist Party was replaced by the second echelon of the Communist Party. There were no reforms, and the transition was actually probably you can say that the transition was very, very slow, and there were no prospects for Romania to join the EU. And you could see that was also a result of disunity of the liberal democratic forces.
They were very small.
They were very small. They fought with each other. They could not really form a force that would oppose the non-liberal democratic regime.
Which was a former communist, essentially.
Yes, it was former communist. It was this liberal democratic facade, and behind it was completely
former communist
illiberal,
parties.
former communists.
And what changed in Romania? Why did that system not last? Which had many of the same had many of the problems you've described, and there was it was very centralized. It was former communist party. It was attempted to undermine free media, undermine its opponents. What changed inside Romania?
Yeah, of course, there were many developments, many positive developments at the end of the 90s and in the beginning of the noughties, but I think that one very important factor is that Romanian society was quite Euro-optimistic. Mm-hmm. Integration in the EU was the consensus. And people believed that Romania's place is in the EU and that consolidated the liberal democratic forces. But also it exerted influence on those former communists. They saw that the source of their power lies in the Euro-optimism of the general public. So they started to reform themselves. But when they started to reform themselves, then the liberal democratic forces they consolidated, and they could then oppose those former communists. And the EU was quite successful in pushing that liberal agenda. Mm-hmm. It invested a lot of money in the civil society, in the NGOs in Romania, in the free media. So this helped Romania to leave that grey area and join the EU in 2007. But similar processes can be observed in Slovakia.
And what about Hungary? Because Hungary did almost exactly the opposite. Can you talk just briefly, and then we'll open the conversation a little bit briefly about what happened in Hungary, because that's really the longest and most detailed part of your paper, to make Hungary change. What were the sources of change there?
Hungary was a very successful country that made the transition to democracy possible already in the 90s. It was like Poland, or the Czech Republic, very successful transition. And Viktor Orban, who now is the bad guy of Central Europe, he was a democratic politician, but already then,
very much
those ideas that he now is implementing, he had all those ideas before. He had the idea of national solidarity, which is by itself is quite good. But if in the 90s he interpreted it in a liberal way, now he's interpreting in the illiberal way.
What do you mean by that? What was the liberal way of being nationally solid? What's the noun? Anyway, what's the liberal way and what's the illiberal way?
You see, yes, I know that in the current debates, nationalism as a concept is quite demonized, but if you look at the 19th century, nationalism was the power that helped transform
I'm not asking for a critique of nationalism, just that what changed in what Orban was doing? Because you're right, I first met him in 1988, I think, when he was very much in favor of liberal democracy. And what changed in the way he ran Hungary between his first term in office and his second?
National solidarity in the illiberal way, it is exclusive. It is, in a way, xenophobic. It is against external influences. It's when you consider your nation as an organic entity that is being undermined by the external forces, but also by the national traitors inside the country. Similar processes can be observed in Russia, of course, when you have those foreign agents, etc. And this is the illiberal way of developing national solidarity. When you focus on the ethnic community as the most important entity in the country, not the civil nation, but an ethnic community, defined in very exclusive terms.
Mm-hmm. And the techniques were some of what you've described here, the undermining of the media, the undermining of the court system.
Yes, most important, the Constitutional Court. Mm-hmm. Because when you rule the Constitutional Court, which is in a parliamentary democracy or liberal democracy, is the most important tool to control politicians and impose or limit their illiberal practices or policies. When you control the constitutional court, you control everything in the country. Then you can control the media, which would be the second step, and that could be seen in those patterns that I briefly discussed.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to turn to Sławomir now, because you've written. I mean, in more than just written, you're sort of this was the purpose of founding your magazine. You've written about how the division of political parties in Central Europe into liberal and illiberal is one of the founding problems in the region. That it's one of the things that has made politics more difficult. Can you elaborate on that a little bit and explain to this audience that thesis?
Only if you will never again call me a journalist.
Okay, sorry. I thought that was
especially
meant to be a compliment.
After what Anton said, I'm a sociologist.
Sorry. I'm a historian, but I'd rather be called a journalist.
But you got Pulitzer Prize, so you can still believe in journalism. But you know what's...
for history, though.
Of course, I write a lot, maybe too much, and it's. But my main profession is activism. So this is my time, or the time of my organization in Poland. But by profession, I'm a sociologist, and I would like to tell you a few words about what stays behind those similarities that Anton and Anna just discussed. So what are the structural reasons for this rise or awakening of illiberalism in this part of Europe? First of all, and you already said that we have very different axes of the main political conflict. So instead of left and right, we have rather right and left, or like right and wrong. So instead of having like two different versions of modernization, we have modernization camp and anti-modernization camp. So to put it in the shortest way, we have liberal camp and illiberal camp from the beginning of 1989. You could have different parties, names and politicians, but actually you always had this competition. And I came to London to visit and to inform about Poland to the Jewish banker. He is called George Soros, who is this big promoter of the open society idea. I met him for the first time and immediately I attacked this idea by asking Soros, tell me who will vote for closed society. Because if it's just the opposition between open and closed society, it's actually not democratic. It doesn't give a choice to the people. If it doesn't give a choice to the people, then where is the pluralism? Where will be the participation? And where will be the identification with the democratic institutions? We cannot have the public sphere divided to open society and closed society, because both sides are not legitimate equally. And also, with this division, you treat your adversary like an enemy of the nation, not as a competitor. And of course, no one identifies with closed society. Always is the opposite who is the closed society, not yourself. As you can call, I'm leftist, for example, and I identify with the left. But then my opponent identifies to the right or something else. But we are legitimate, equally, more or less. So actually, it somehow worked like a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if the open society elites begins transition in this region, mostly dissidents in Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic, and liberal communists in other countries of this region, one day they will make mistake for any reason. And then who comes to power? Closed society elites. So this is how Mečiar, Orban, Kaczyński, Václav Klaus, those guys, when you have this kind of division, were doomed somehow to come to power. The ruling party in Poland, after 8 years, left the position with the growth in the last 8 years, the biggest in OECD, with unemployment for the first time lower than 10%, with the deficit diminished from 8 to 3. So the best figures in Europe, and they lost. And they lost to the party that, for the first time in history, rules Poland fully. Just have
without a
coalitioner,
allies, without a coalition partner.
Exactly. So how was it possible? It was possible for many reasons, not necessarily I would say some direct reasons, as the harakiri of Polish president, unexpected totally, who then started a domino, created a big crater in Polish politics, and the entire ruling party went there. But behind it, I would say this is this main structuralism, this dysfunctional conflict between this, like, we can call it differently, like, for this discussion, we can call it liberal camp and illiberal camp. But you can ask why this way the conflict looks like. First, no left. After 60 years of communism, who wanted to be a left? I mean, actually, my generation is the first who identifies with. I mean, I'm talking about certain people, or like generation in a political sense. So like people who are active in the public sphere. But I'm not talking about the like statistical generation, because this is more right wing and always was in Poland. But so after communism, this left part was illegitimate a priori. So you couldn't have actually left and right division. You could have, but then 1989 is also the year, which is meaningful, of course, it's just by chance, but not fully by chance. This is the same year when Francis Fukuyama published his article and then the book, End of History. And he was, of course, right. Everybody is laughing about him, but he was right. Like, to find an alternative to the free market and liberal democracy was unimaginable that time. And still, I mean, even we published Piketty in Poland, my organization, we published Stiglitz, we published Krugman, we published Dani Rodrik, all those guys, but still it's very hard to imagine different economic system. Let's be honest. So this was the apogee of the belief in neoliberalism, which is another factor that created this, that like excluded the possibility of any left. Like the third way was not really of Blairism or Schroederism, was not really like, was a kind of a giving up. When it comes to ideology, could be successful politically and in the party politics competition, but ideologically it was like the, step back to the division like liberalism, illiberalism mostly. And then, of course, you have also, you were talking about the region where the liberal tradition is very weak and was actually never strong. It's not the country of John Locke or I don't know, Benjamin Constant.
Although there are other parts of Europe where the liberal tradition has been very weak, like, for example, Germany before 1945, but that's
not really. I would call come on. Kant actually is one of the founding fathers of political liberalism.
I don't want to go that way.
One.
Sorry.
Why not? Come on, let's.
Carl Schmitt. Okay, let's not go that way.
Even Carl Schmitt. No. Carl Schmitt is a very good example. Carl Schmitt actually was one of the philosophers that like, I don't know, do you have this English word, apagogical? So in the reversed way to prove something. Never mind.
I don't know.
Carl Schmitt could be useful to explain why open society doesn't guarantee pluralism and conflict does. This is why I would say that he was.
So you need a conflict in society between groups that are arguing. Legitimate conflict. And if you have only an illegitimate conflict between people who are in favor of freedom and people who are in favor of, I don't know, something else, then you don't have. Then it's hard to have a real political debate.
What I'm saying is that to have liberal democracy, you need liberals. And it's easy to impose democracy, but it's very hard to impose liberalism. And like you can do democratic procedures, implement them in one day, as they did 1989 mostly. But how you want to implement liberalism? And this part of the Europe that usually was partitioned between Russia and Germany are based on the very militaristic identity. So instead of liberals, we still have soldiers without uniforms, but still they are thinking on this axis of resistance or betrayal. This is the Polish way of thinking. You're with us or without or not. It doesn't give a big field of maneuver for liberalism. These are there are more, and we can discuss it, but there are the main structural reasons why it must have been coming back. I think somehow, it's hard to create liberal democracy here.
Let me also warn the audience that was a joke about George Soros as the Jewish banker, because I think that there's a reference. Recently, there were big demonstrations in Poland, and
Paweł Kukiz, one of the populists.
One of our populist leaders said, "Oh, they've been organized by a Jewish banker," but I'm not going to tell you what his name. I'm not going to tell you what his name is. So anyway, that was a joke.
Kukiz, yeah.
Kukiz no, I mean your joke was a joke.
Yeah, of course. I thought.
So I suddenly worried.
And they were laughing, you know. So.
No, I didn't know if everybody got that. Anyway, never mind. Yeah, I actually disagree in one area, which is that I think actually a lot of the things that have happened in Central Europe, particularly over the last couple of years, are not so different from what's happened in Western Europe. And I think the rise of Marine Le Pen, that's the sort of obvious example, but I mean the very fact that Anton uses the expression Berlusconiization to talk about something that's happening to the media in the region shows that this is something that actually came from Italy. You know, the real pioneer for trying to undermine and control and use the media to bring someone, to bring yourself to power is Berlusconi. And so Andrej Babiš is a sort of, he's just following this wonderful Western example. And I think that many of the trends are cross-regional rather than Central European. That would be my only...
Can I disagree?
You can disagree.
I would say that you have both rises of illiberalism on both sides of Europe. And those three crises in EU, actually the common victim is liberalism. I'm talking about refugees, economic crisis, and geopolitical crisis. So like terrorism, Russia, ISIS. So it creates the same structural problem, because when the Front National gets bigger support, when the refugees are arriving, immediately, unfortunately, this liberal democracy, we're not angels, yes. So wherever you have refugees, far right parties are going up, and I would say that what happens is that look at the last Euro election. In last Euro election, in two most traditional democracies, French and best established democracies, French and British, the far right won. And why actually? If you think if you can imagine what voter thought before the ballot, when everything was decided for him before, what are the biggest two fractions? Who will be the commissioner? Everything. The only thing that was left to you, the only real choice was you vote for mainstream or you vote for anti-mainstream. And 25% people wanted maybe to save their dignity of being a voter by voting those guys. It's not the only reason, but whenever you have grand coalitions, like in Austria, and then you get Haider, whenever the mainstream looks like open society, you somehow, if they make a mistake or something, or just you'll get bored of it, then closed society is ruling. So the same division is being more and more popular in the West also. That's my point.
I'm not sure why that disagrees with me. Anyway, never mind. So.
I'm just saying that that for different paths.
No, they're different paths, but some of the paths, I think it's not accidental that some of these things are happening at the same time for similar reasons. I mean, I think the crash of the euro had a very profound ripple effect. I mean, or the perceived troubles of the euro. Not so much, I mean, they seem to have been kind of solved financially in most countries, maybe not in Greece. But the perception, the perception certainly in the East, but also around the world and also in much of Western countries was, okay, well, there are many problems with Europe, but at least the Germans know what they're doing and the economy is successful, and they're offering us a model and they're showing us a decent way to run the continent. And once that was undermined, then you had all kinds of funny things began to happen. Europe isn't a model. This was Viktor Orban has said this openly. That Europe, that's not our model anymore. We're looking for something else. We want a different idea. We want to distance ourselves from that model, and we're going to find something else. And he's found it in his own own set of ideas about Hungary's uniqueness and so on. But others, I think, have made the same conclusion. Anton, one of the things you talk about at the end of your paper is you talk about what are useful reactions for outsiders. When there has been to Orban or to Haider really in Austria, or to when there are these, I don't know what word we're using, when there are these liberal forces come to power in a European country, what are things that outsiders can do? What role can EU institutions or indeed the governments of other countries play to be useful? And you talk about that at the end a little bit.
Yes, and Haider was already mentioned. If you remember, in 2001, the Conservative Party in Austria, the People's Party of Austria, formed a coalition with the far-right party, with the Freedom Party, and there were no sanctions against Austria from the EU, so on the pan-European level, but there were sanctions on the individual level. So basically, all the members of the EU, they cut diplomatic relations with Austria.
I have a memory of awful things like the Austrian foreign minister not being allowed to come to lunch and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's it. And that backfired. That backfired, and all those sanctions were lifted in half a year, 6 months. Because Eurosceptic party, such as Freedom Party, Euroscepticism started to grow in Austria. It started to become, it was becoming bigger, and that was a backfire. So my idea is that the response from the EU, it should not be like a knee-jerk reaction. No, you cannot talk about sanctions now. Because that might provoke the growth of even more illiberalism, of even more Euroscepticism.
People become defensive. Why are these foreigners criticizing our country?
And for example, that case, that Austrian case, it was a good lesson for the EU, because when, for example, in Italy, Berlusconi formed a coalition with the Lega Nord, with the Northern League, which is a far-right party, there was no response. There was concern, but there were no reaction, just to not provoke. The same happened in Slovakia. And so first is to exercise caution. So what can be done? We can see that a lot of influence in terms of helping some particular individual politicians to develop a liberal democracy in the country, a lot of influence comes from Russia. And one of the tools that Russia is using...
This is also brought out in the paper, in some specific examples, for example, in the Czech Republic.
One of the major tools that Russia is using against liberal democracies in the region and in the EU as such is the energy politics. And it's been going on since the 90s. Gazprom tried to somehow influence politics in individual countries. So what the EU can do is to develop and advance the energy union. And most importantly, to speak with one voice with Russia in the area of energy politics. If individual countries, they are just left on their own, they will not be able to compete or debate properly with Russia, because they would have this weaker position.
Yeah, the argument is that in a very small country like the Czech Republic, there aren't really any, this is not a problem that you notice in the UK, but in a very small country like the Czech Republic, for example, you don't have companies that are big enough to compete with Russian companies. And so when Russian companies come in the country
with their politics,
when they inevitably bring politics and they inevitably support particular politicians and so on, then unless there's unless there's some backing. Anyway, they have they have a lot of trouble competing with it. And so you were suggesting, and as as others have written, that EU-wide energy policy, which is maybe there are other reasons to argue for it in other contexts. One of the effects that it would have would be to at least protect the sense of independence of countries in that region. And this is also, of course, a big problem in Hungary as well, where Orban has also saying that he needs to protect his country's energy independence, has done a deal with Russia over a very strange deal over a nuclear plant. Anyway, I've interrupted you.
Yeah, the second suggestion would be to support the free media and the public media in individual countries. As I said, that was one of the patterns of illiberalization, where the free media or public media, they are undermined, either from a liberal force or from this trend of Berlusconization. The training programs for the journalists that were developed in the 90s, they no longer work. The media environment has changed dramatically. Now we have online media, now we have this, what sometimes I call alternative media that promote the ultra-nationalism and conspiracy theories. We have social media. Who could have thought in the 90s that online social media would be important, or social networks would be important? Facebook and Twitter, they have changed the media environment completely. Sometimes people get their information only from Facebook and Twitter.
Yeah, and this is not only a Central European problem.
Yeah. But again, this is one of the problems.
And the point being that this is of course there needs to be a wider conversation, I think, in the democratic world about the state of media and how to somehow embed fact-checking or embed some new some way of distinguishing, some way of ranking media.
This is
we're running a project this year which will look at different efforts that have been made in different places to, I don't know what's the right expression, bring back truth to media, or exactly. Well, that's the problem. The problem is that even talking about it makes you sound like you're on the far right.
This is good. The suggestion that I made is already developing.
Yeah, but this is something that we're working on.
The third point is that NATO and the EU, they should increase their visibility in individual countries. Communication should become stronger. The problem is that there is more EU in conspiracy theories than in reality.
Also, not a Central European issue.
The EU is lacking communication. The EU is lacking communication. For many people, for the general public, EU is some kind of this Brussels monster that is out there. They don't see anything good coming from the EU, although structural funds for the development of the countries is a significant contribution for the countries. But communication is lacking. Communication is lacking.
You've heard this, and you also read the paper. Do you agree with some of these ideas?
And
do you have others?
Yeah. I mean, this is very important and very rarely told about, like especially this energy union, for example. This entire region used to be, not anymore it is so strongly, but used to be monopolized by Gazprom. And Gazprom, Germans even founded the new version of socialism, Gazprom socialism, invented by Schroeder. And this was a big problem. And also look at what happened. There is like a new Comintern built on Russian influence among far-right parties and some far-left parties as well, who are receiving Russian and multiplying Russian propaganda, especially when it comes to Ukraine. They're going Ukrainian fascists all the time. However, you don't have any nationalist party even in the parliament. And you have two nationalist parties that I've already mentioned winning elections in France and Great Britain. But of course, you're right. I mean, Russian influences is one thing. The problem is that the different traditions. So, like, Hungary was never part of Russian Empire, as Poland was. So they have very different. However, Orban started as the biggest Russophobe. His career started with this big speech: "Russians go home." I mean, in a more less elegant way. But then a year ago, he put flowers on the graves of Russian Soviet soldiers that drowned in the blood the Budapest uprising in 1956. So you can make this evolution.
There was a controversy. I mean, he may have passed that particular monument, not laying flowers there, but he was close to this monument. There was very versions of what happened, actually. Honestly.
Okay.
Right, I'll let you guys argue about that later.
Never mind. The evolution is anyway very big. He accepted the monopolization of energetic policy in Hungary when it comes to the plants, the nuclear plants.
It's nuclear, not all policy, but the nuclear plant. There was a particular plant that he did a deal with, very secretive deal.
Which is still secret. So
yes.
With a very big debt and so on. So, but actually, he accepted strong influence and connection of Russia. Okay. And look at Slovakia, look at Czech Republic. Only Poland actually has very different attitude. However, it is still strongly.
And there's a very strong Russian presence in the Poland online media as well.
I wouldn't call it strong. I would say that the fact that anything exists like this in Polish society that is really very skeptical to Russia is meaningful. With this, I would agree. But other than that, you don't have any serious politicians that would be pro-Russian in Poland.
The far right is pro-Russian, but yes.
And also this first doctrine, this first point of any Polish foreign doctrine, that independent Poland exists only when the Ukraine is independent. So there will be no independent Poland without independent Ukraine. Whoever becomes the foreign minister in Poland begins to write the program with this point, I think. And it's not a part of the Eastern doctrine, it's a part of any doctrine, I think. It's hard to imagine independent Poland without this buffer. And also, so this is why Poles are so pro-Ukrainian, not because we are so good, but because we are afraid of Russia. So with this I agree. I also agree with media. And it's very hard to find a model that would work in internet for any media, for New York Times even. So those newspapers, it's very, media, you cannot fight corruption if you don't have free media, for example. You cannot fight many problems if you don't have free media. And to have free media, even if there are no other dangers, it's very hard to sustain.
You see, with the media, going back to the media very, very briefly, for the paper I interviewed journalists, editors from various countries in the region, and sometimes their replies to my questions were very similar in a sense that they said, look, when we prepared to join the EU, we had funding from the EU for the development of the independent media. What happened after we joined the EU is that funding stopped. And especially after the financial crisis of 2008. What happened? Multinationals left, in many countries, multinational companies that owned the media, the German, the Swiss, they left those countries. And those major media were bought up by the oligarchs, by the moguls. And there was no funding from the EU because, okay, you're now a member of the EU. You're now quite normal. You don't need this. Actually, it turned out that there is still a need from the EU as a contribution to the development of the free media in those countries. And the last point that what the EU can do is that I think it's crucial that corruption in the EU should be considered a threat to the European security. This is no longer an individual problem for those countries. This is about the EU, this is about the unity of the EU, this is about the economy of the EU as a union. And I think we all know, and I should bring up this R word again, talking about Russia. Russia is investing in corrupting the EU. It is a strategic investment in the process of undermining the EU, in undermining the transatlantic cooperation. And this is very important. Corruption should be dealt with quite aggressively, I think.
Well, because a lot of corruption is actually cross EU, and a lot of it's not based in Central Europe,
this is
but
not
rather
Central
in
Europe.
Switzerland. Right. This is not a Central European problem.